and how we can make sure that they have these skills as well. Okay, so some can hear me, some can't hear me in the chat. Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, if you're having problems, go ahead and try logging off and logging back in. I hope that will help you.
And just so everyone is aware, I just started recording. We're going to record this afternoon session.
Wonderful. So again, I'm Marcy Wilburn. A little bit about my background. I have twin boys who are in first grade this year, and that's about as good of a family picture as you can get with two wild and crazy twin boys. I love Diet Coke, chocolate, beach. Those are the ways to win me over, absolutely. My background is from Indiana State University. I have a bachelor's in education, both special education and general education, K-12 mild intervention, special education, and then K-6 primary generalist are my license. I have a master's in applied behavior analysis from Ball State University, and I'm currently working on my doctorate in curriculum instruction from Indiana State University. I started teaching in Brownsburg and taught there more in a resource room, co-teaching type setting at both the high school and elementary levels initially. My husband and I moved, and I started teaching middle school math for a couple of years, and then I moved over to grant work. So I've been doing this work for about 10 years now, both with the Indiana IEP Resource Center and prior to this, working with the Promoting Achievement for Students with Sensory Loss project. So that's a little bit about my background and why I'm here with you today. But we're going to talk a lot about high leverage practices. So before we can get started, I want to know what's your experience, what's your knowledge base. I just told you a little bit about me. So I want to know more about you and where you are comfortable within the high leverage practices that we're going to talk about today. So go ahead and pick up your phone. You can scan the QR code here, or you can go ahead and type the URL within your website, and you can fill that in. Either way, go ahead and answer every question for me. I'll give you a couple seconds to scan that. Okay, let's see where we're at. You should have followed me over to mentimeter.com. So we have a little bit of smaller group this time. We have our special education teachers, which we expected. Welcome, SLP, other related service provider. I'm assuming OT or PT, but correct me if I'm wrong and put it in the chat. All right, wonderful. The next question talks about how long you've been teaching. So we have some newbies, and we have several veteran teachers, and then a few in the middle as well. I recognize that you all are bringing a sense of expertise to this conversation as well. So this is going to be a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion. As I said in the introduction, please feel free to share and comment throughout today's session. What grade levels do you primarily serve? So biggest group of elementary within this session. What settings do you typically provide services? A lot of push-in, a lot of co-teaching. That's wonderful. Of course, we want students to have access to their core content. Some resource room setting and alternative placement. Self-contained, still wavering a little bit, and some consultative services as well. Wonderful. All right. And this is a question that we will kind of revisit each time we come into a session together. So as Todd mentioned and I mentioned, we're going to cover the first 3 high leverage practices, which is all about collaboration today. And it looks like most are fairly confident when we're talking about collaboration with other stakeholders to be successful. The next domain that we won't talk about today, but in our subsequent sessions we will, is around assessment. So we have a 7.2 in our levels of efficacy around understanding data and analyzing data and being able to convey that information to others, which is interesting because I'm just looking at this morning, it was around a 7.5 for that category. And then supporting the social, emotional, behavioral growth of students, 8.2. So fairly confident in that as well. And then instruction to support learning goals also at 8.2, which instruction was the highest this morning with an 8.5 level of efficacy. So these are the 4 domains that we're going to be talking about throughout the entire series, but today we'll focus on collaboration. Thank you for doing that for me. It helps paint a picture of what's needed within the session and who we're targeting. So the goals of the session today are really to allow you to gain knowledge and access to resources around high leverage practices. Yes in the chat if you've heard of high leverage practices before. No in the chat if you have not. Wonderful. So I will start by saying this is something when we're talking about these high leverage practices that came out around 2015 from the CEC, the Council for Exceptional Children, and the Cedar Center. These are not things that are new, but they are things that we need to be seeing consistently and frequently within classrooms in order to impact our outcomes for students with disabilities. So again, nothing that's new, but think about your current practice as we go through these things, and are you doing them consistently and frequently? The next thing I want you to understand by the end of today's session is how high leverage practices can both positively impact students with and without disabilities. And specifically, we're going to look at the first 3 on collaboration. So we have stuff today, and we will have stuff for our entire series. I'm going to pull up the Padlet for you, and I will go back to that slide so you'll have time to dive into it. But each one of our sessions, we will continue to build on this Padlet. It'll be the same link for the entire series, but the first column is just the overview documents that we have. So highleveragepractices.org has a plethora of information, almost too much. I would argue it gets a little overwhelming, but I've tried to direct you to some of my favorite things that I would like you to have access to. One of those is a self-assessment tool. So we don't have time to dive necessarily into the self-assessment tool today, but I want you to, 1, be aware that it is available for you. And 2, you can go through all 22 of the practices and rate yourself. How do I feel I'm doing in this area? And there's key components under each of the practices that you can kind of see what are the things that I am doing well and what can I continue to improve upon within the high leverage practices. As I said, the website's a little overwhelming, so they do offer like a walking tour of the website. So if you want to dive into some of the meat, this is there for you. I know that you have so much time to do that, but I just wanted to make it a little bit easier to access this document because it's hard to find when you get to the website. And the most important, which as Todd said, you all should have or will be getting, are the laminated guides. So there are a couple of books on high leverage practices offered by the Council for Exceptional Children and Cedar Center. But my recommendation to you is this is the good stuff, the meat, the stuff that you have time for. So these trifolds offer what it is and various strategies to support it. So today we're going to be looking at trifold number 1, which is on collaboration. And I also have the slide deck in here for you as well. And any additional resources that we talk about under collaboration, we will add those as well. Like I said, then we'll go over the next 3 domains. And I also added in our fall training catalog just for the Resource Center if there are topics that you're interested in. This actually goes until September 30th, and we're hoping to have a new catalog out for you soon past September 30th. All right, so I will go here, give you a couple seconds to either grab that QR code or type in the URL. As I said, it will not change. And I will have at least a slide in there each session for you to access that again if needed. Okay, so what constitutes an effective special educator? Go ahead and just in the chat, type out some words. What do you think constitutes an effective special educator? Collaborative. Thanks, Terry. Love for students, meeting them where they're at. Patient, consistent, flexible. So these are all the characteristics of an effective special educator. Consistent problem solver, communication, patient, flexible, creative. Compassionate. A lot of similarities throughout your answers. Understanding learning styles and helping individuals see their own learning style. Okay, now let's switch to the next question. What do you feel are the instructional practices that are best for fostering student engagement and learning? Meaningful feedback. Tapping into student interest. Nice. Student conferencing and check-ins. Small chunks of teaching. Feedback and positivity. Contextualizing information. Relationships, so important. Scaffolding. I think we could go on and on and on. And because of that, what we need to make sure is what we are doing in classrooms is effective. And high leverage practices are what we want to see happening frequently that all K-12 special educators should know how to do. And I would argue all educators should know how to do. We know that students with disabilities and our English language learners are the lowest performing student groups, both in the state and at the national level, and historically always have been. So the Council for Exceptional Children and the Cedar Center saw a time for change and said, what do we need to do differently in order to improve these outcomes? We want to increase achievement levels, and we want to ensure that all students are college or career ready upon exiting high school. And what they found is that it's all in improving the practice of our teachers. So we have students who have barriers, who have different home lives, who come to school with varying struggles, but it is not that background that causes students to be successful or not. It is how can we improve the practice of our teachers to improve outcomes for our students. And that's what MSD Wayne Township is doing. They're saying, we know there's these high leverage practices out here. We do need to invest time within our teachers in order to improve their practices. And again, many of these things I am sure you are already doing, but some of them you may not be doing as frequently or consistency as what you need to do in order to improve outcomes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And how can we get to that point? So 22 high leverage practices in these 4 areas: collaboration, assessment, social, emotional, behavioral learning, and instruction. So let's tap right into number 1, high leverage practice for collaboration. The first one is collaborating with professionals to increase student success. So let's start with an activity. Think about the most complex student that you serve. Now in your mind, come up with a number of how many professionals support this student. And you can even think within the school setting, or you can think both in school and out of school context of how many professionals are supporting this student, and write that number within the chat for me. Interesting. It's looking like the 5 to 10 range, which was the exact same answer in this morning's session. So when we're talking about our students, we know that special educators cannot do this work within a silo. We are working with multiple other people to ensure that our students have access to curriculum and are able to be successful. Sometimes the weight of improving outcomes for students with disabilities feels as if it falls solely on special educators. But that's exactly the opposite of the message that we want to convey. It should be both a general education perspective and a special education perspective, because special education students are general education students first. And we need to make sure that all educators within the building have a sense of shared responsibility around working with all students within the school. So it's not a your students, my students language. It's really talking about these are our students and we're all going to support them. If you have a kindergartner who walks into a building and you say good morning to that kindergarten as they enter and you know their name, but you're a 5th grade teacher, that gives you 5 years to develop that relationship and rapport with that student, potentially before you're going to have them in your classroom. So you can start to foster those relationships early on, and you can look at the our students, not yours versus my students. Relationships was something that somebody already included within the chat. And how do we create that sense of belonging for all of our students? Yes or no in the chat. How many of you are familiar with Hattie's zone of desired effect or visible learning? Okay, wonderful. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this today. So when we talk about Hattie's work, he takes several studies. So he takes meta-analysis of studies and groups them together to see what instructional practices are most effective to improve outcomes for students. And within these studies, what he has found is that some of the practices, even some practices that we're using today, can actually have a reverse effect on student learning. Other practices have what he calls a developmental effect. So these are improvements that students would make regardless of the education that's being taught, regardless of the practices that are being applied. Students just get these things. They're developmental. The next set that he talks about are these are the effects that happen when we apply these practices, that typical effects, if they have any teacher, they are going to fall in this range. This is the outcome level based on these instructional practices. And the last zone is the zone of desired effect. And this is any instructional practice that promotes evidence that students either grow 0.4 or all the way to 1, really above 1. And that's the zone of desired effect. So those practices that we invest in when we're looking at the zone of desired effect is optimal for student learning. We're getting the most bang for our buck if we invest in these instructional practices. So here's an example of some that you can look through. For instance, if students are retained, we know research is telling us that does not promote successful outcomes for students. It actually has a reverse effect. And students aren't able to master content as well when they're retained. They maintain that same level or that same gap from their peers. But then you continue to go up. And if we are using mentoring within the classroom, or if we're using co-teaching, those are some of those developmental effects. And then we have teacher effects in the classroom. So homework, ability grouping, all of those things are good, but there are things that are better, that in the time spent providing instruction, we can get more out of our students. And the one being the highest right now is that collective teacher efficacy. So collective teacher efficacy really is looking at, one, do we have the confidence and the competence to be able to help our students grow and to be able to provide the instruction and supports that they need? So not only do you need the belief that students can do it and that you're able to teach them, you also need the knowledge base and the skills to be able to teach them. But notice the word collective. It's not just special educators, it's all teachers within the building. And it really is dependent upon what teachers do, not what students are bringing with them to the table. So we're going to listen to Hattie in a short video, and he's going to be talking about collective teacher efficacy. As we're watching this video, I want you to think about, one, what is my level of efficacy to support students with disabilities? What are the general education teachers or other colleagues with whom I work? That could be paraprofessionals, that could be administrative staff, that could be instructional assistants. What's their level of efficacy around supporting students, both at-risk students, students with disabilities, or general education peers? And think through that. Also, I want you to think through what he states about how do we improve collective teacher efficacy. So 2 things: what's your level, and how do we improve teacher collective efficacy within our systems? And if you could, I'm going to go ahead and press play on this, but if you could go ahead and tell me in the chat or even just visually with a thumbs up that you can hear, that would be great.
Number one in visible learning is teachers' collective efficacy. And on the one hand, that's exciting because it confirms the story. On the other hand, it's a bit of an unfortunate title. It kind of implies that having efficacy, having confidence, having all the teachers in the school believing they can make a difference. It's actually more than that. Now, to have a meta-analysis, you have to have lots of studies. This is not a new idea. This has been around a long time. But it's just that Rachel Ells was the one that pulled it all together to show what its combined effect was. And the message I want to get across, it is teachers working together to have appropriately high, challenging expectations of what a year's growth for a year's input looks like, fed with the evidence of impact. And that's what sustains it. It isn't just growth mindset. It's not just rah-rah thinking. It's not just, oh, we can make a difference. But it's that combined belief that it's us that causes learning. It's not the students. It's not the students from particular social backgrounds. It's not all the barriers out there. Because when you fundamentally believe you can make the difference, and then you feed it with the evidence you are, that is dramatically powerful.
Okay, so let's just have a little bit of a conversation. We will not have a conversation about your kind of self-rating and your thought, but thinking about what he said about collective teacher efficacy. And it's more than just raw thinking. What other parts do we need to be in place in order to really promote a sense of collective teacher efficacy within our systems? High expectations, absolutely. And high expectations for all. Sometimes we have to dissect that word all. It's not just students who are served in an LRE code 50 or least restrictive environment code 50 that says that they're in the general education classroom 80% or more of the day. It's all of our students, whether you are in a functional skills type program or whether you are in a general education classroom. We have to have those high expectations for students. Belief that we can make the difference. Backing it up with consistent practices, wonderful. He said one more thing that at the end that I think was very important. Collaborating with teachers, consistent follow through, absolutely. He closed out by saying backing it with evidence. So as special ed teachers, we may be working with general education teachers or other colleagues, and we may not feel as if we are welcome necessarily. Maybe some teachers have the general education environment and they feel like that's their classroom as opposed to our classroom and our students. And sometimes we need data to show that what we're doing is effective. And so backing it up with that evidence and making sure we're looking at, is our instruction working? Is it not working? And how can we change it? Because once it starts working and the data shows that, that increases that teacher efficacy. So looking at data over time is so important. Yes, so April commented, sometimes I feel more like an instructional assistant within the classroom. Absolutely. Just quick story time really quickly. I won't spend too much time. My first year teaching, I was co-teaching at a high school level, and I came in and I was working with a 35 plus year veteran teacher who taught Algebra 2. And of course, me being fresh out of college, as soon as I got the job, I started emailing all the teachers, ask if I could meet with them to really start that co-planning process of what I was taught was co-teaching, that co-planning, co-teaching, co-assessing. And I walk into his, or I email so excited and I never heard a response. And I email again and I never heard a response. And so the first day of class, I walk in because I'm supposed to be scheduled to be with him. And of course, I was completely dismissed. He had never had anyone in his room, did not think it was important to have me in his room. And part of my job was to win him over and prove to him that I could be an effective participant within his classroom. And I think sometimes that's the start of the work of working with our colleagues who maybe don't feel as if they need us, but our job is to show them that we have a skill set that they don't have. His job was to know Algebra 2 inside and out. He was the content expert. I was definitely not the content expert when it came to Algebra 2, but I was also able to provide strategies that my students could utilize to be more successful. And what I found was his strategy was, if students don't understand, I'm just going to talk a little bit louder. Well, that did not work for the students within the classroom. So over time, I was able to help him with some of those strategies, help him to provide those accommodations that students needed in order to be successful. And it was successful not just for students with disabilities, but also for general education students as well. And in time, he saw me as a valuable member within the classroom, but it took me time to get there. And sometimes we have our teachers that are completely receptive to us being in their rooms, but we have to treat that situation differently than how we might teach more of this veteran teacher who did not want me in his space. I had to start a little bit slower, but I knew that if I saw it through and could show him the data that kids were more successful, then it would work. So we talked about that zone of desired effect, and anything above a 0.4 is really where we want to invest our time and efforts in our instructional practices. Collective teacher efficacy is a 1.57. So we know that if we can have high expectations for students and believe that they can do it and work together and look at data to improve our practices over time, that we can positively impact student outcomes. And I think it's important to know that we also have a self-efficacy for our students. And how do we promote that self-efficacy in our students? If we are encouraging students to have high expectations of themselves and believe that they can be successful in their learning, that has an effect size of a 1.44. So also very high. So think about taking collective teacher efficacy alongside student self-efficacy and putting that together, and how much we can improve our student outcomes over time with just those two things. So collaboration is so important when it comes to the work of improving outcomes for students with disabilities. But we have to have the belief as special educators, and we have to help our other colleagues recognize that they have to have those beliefs as well. So let's do some reflection at this point in time. So what does this professional collaboration currently look like within MSD Wayne Township? And it's going to be different. We have teachers who are all different levels across the board. We have teachers who are serving students with various levels of need. So go ahead and just put what your collaboration currently looks like within the chat, or feel free to unmute if you'd prefer to speak out. Working together, talking about students, figuring out best ways to support them. Team meetings, cast meetings. You may have to fill me in on that one. I'm not familiar with that term. Brainstorming best strategies, not only for learning, but behavioral needs, PLCs, co-teaching, both formal and informal meetings. We're going to get to meetings here in a minute. Working as a team, co-teaching, shared Google Docs, wonderful. Staffing for students, check-ins, working as a cohesive team, observing other people's practices. What can we learn from one another? Absolutely. Do you currently have a sense of collective teacher efficacy to support student outcomes? And why don't we do a always, sometimes, never? So A, S, or N within the chat of how you're feeling about that. Figured there'd be a lot of sometimes if I gave that option, because in different settings, you feel differently. It's nice to see some A's in theirs as well. Wonderful. And it's really good that not a single N came up. Not that I don't want you to be honest, but I think that many of you are recognizing that we do have this and we are working well with our colleagues. And then the last one, we have to address what are the barriers to effective collaboration. So some of you who put your S's within there, what are the barriers? And then we might call upon some of the people who input the A's to how did you overcome those? Time, biggest one this morning as well. Time. Negative Nancy's, always. Definitely going to have to work to change mindsets of some of the individuals with whom you work. Servicing several grades and trying to schedule all of that. So if you put an A as always having that collective teacher efficacy, not that there's not barriers, I recognize there still are for you, but what are some ways that you overcome that barrier of time, which seems to be one of the issues? I think Google Docs was already an answer that can be applied. Texting, emails, Google Docs. Not enough time in different planning periods. How do you use the texting, emails, and Google Docs to suffice with that? How do you, Todd might not like this, but how do you work with administration to what does common plan time look like if needed? And I know scheduling is probably one of the most difficult things, but sometimes if it's a system level thing that is above your pay grade that you don't get to make decisions on, it's conveying what's not working. Not saying it's going to necessarily get better overnight, but something to consider is how do we come up with common plan time? What does that look like? Are you not doing duties in the morning so that you can create some common plan time? Different potential solutions for that. Built-in team planning's working. Having special education teachers be a part of grade level teams, be a part of content teams at the upper levels. Definitely not working in the silos that we've worked in historically in the past. Wonderful. So some things to help, and you've hit on many of those things, but within your trifold, there is a whole section on collaboration activities and skills. And there is also a collaboration skills reflection tool that just talks about how are we actively listening to people. I teach a class at IU Kokomo to undergraduates all around teaming, and we fill out a self-assessment of skills around listening and nonverbals and all of those communication skills. And I have found that I am a very poor listener. I am always trying to think of what I need to say next, as opposed to really taking in the information that's shared and conveyed with me. So those are some things that you can think about within your meetings with teachers and in your collaborations. Are you truly listening to what's being said within those conversations? But all of that is available for you within your first trifold. So high leverage practice number 2 on collaboration is organize and facilitate effective meetings with professionals and families. So let's go ahead in the chat. Go ahead and describe the types of meetings you are currently facilitating, both formal and informal, as a special educator. ACRs, so more formal. Staffings would be your informal, team meetings, case conferences, phone calls, parent square. Just reviewing accommodations with staff. Utilizing those IEPs at a glance. Family group decision meetings. Your schedule has several meetings with several different stakeholders that you are responsible for as a special educator. And oftentimes, even in a case conference, though we have public agency reps and we have other individuals who attend those conferences, oftentimes you're facilitating that meeting. So as you're facilitating those meetings, what are the meeting components that you feel are essential to your meeting success? What do you always have in place at your meetings? Or maybe wish you always had in place at your meetings? Guide or agenda with the goals. Action steps for what's next. Timelines. So not only what you're responsible for when you leave, but when do I need to get it done? Agendas. Data. Have to have data if we're having conversations around the data. Talk about the positives and the strengths. What's going well? We kick off several of our district leadership team meetings with the celebrations within districts with whom we're working. Started off on a good note. Another one that I would consider, if you don't already have it, what are norms for the meeting? Making sure that all voices are heard within the meeting. Thinking about our parent voice, our educator voice. Speaking of data, making sure that we're communicating ahead of time what the expectation is for all of the attendees within the meeting, whether that's bringing data, whether that's bringing information, letting people know their role ahead of time. Someone to keep the meeting on track. Absolutely. So we're going to stick to this agenda so that we accomplish everything. How do you determine whether your meeting is effective or ineffective? Staying present. Making sure we get to everything on the agenda. We have mutually agreed upon outcomes. We're leaving with a plan. Because what we don't want to happen is people to leave the meetings that we call and feel like this. How many of you have ever felt like this before? Yeah, we want a meeting where when people come, they feel as if it was time well spent, rather than just something I could have sent out in an email. And time was our biggest barrier to collaboration. So if we are going to plan a meeting, we better plan a meeting so that it's going to be effective. And just like many of you said, we are going to have assignments following the meeting. We're going to have outcomes after the meeting, responsibilities. What's that follow-up look like? If it is just informational and can be sent as an email, provide it in an email. If it's something that requires further discussion or collaboration amongst the team, then we're going to come together and have those conversations. Somebody earlier said, I sent a couple emails and I didn't get any responses. So then it warranted a meeting. But she attempted the least intrusive mode of communication first. And sometimes we can do that, and other times we have to go straight to a meeting because there is times that we need to have that conversation. But even in your informal meetings, it's nice to have kind of a standing agenda. So even if we're talking about a staffing or even a collaboration 15 minutes in the hallway, you don't want to spend your first 10 minutes just talking about the struggles a student is having. Maybe you set that to the first 3 minutes, and then by minute 4, you're already talking about strategies that can be successful, because it's really easy to spend time talking about what is not going well rather than focusing on what we can do differently. So be mindful of that. Help teach others with whom you're talking to stay mindful of that as well. So you can start talking about what's effective rather than just what is not working. Okay, there are a couple things within your high leverage practice trifold. There is a checklist to prepare for meetings. So what you need to get ready, and many of you already said these things already. We need goals, we need an agenda, we need norms. And then there also is a checklist to facilitate effective meetings. So how are we following up after the meeting to assure things get done? What are we doing to make sure that the student is at the center of the meeting and we're not going talking about extraneous things that isn't pertinent or spending too much time on things that's not meaningful and not helpful to the cause. So those are available for you as well within your trifold. The last high leverage practice that we're going to cover today is all about collaborating with families to support student learning and secure needed services. So another large part of being a special educator is communicating with those families and those who support the learning of students outside of school. So when we're talking about the families or caretakers of individuals that we are serving, thinking a lot about how are we meeting the needs of that family. And I love that it says not only supporting the student learning, but securing needed services. I think it's important to note here that part of our job is to also connect our families with outside resources outside of school that can be helpful to their students. So when I first started teaching, I didn't know a lot about the waiver processes. I didn't know who was eligible to receive waivers. I didn't know in a case conference committee at a kindergarten level, it may be important for students to get on a waiting list for a waiver because it takes so long. So that wasn't my job to know the ins and outs of waivers, but I did have a responsibility to know that it was something that could support my students outside of school and connecting parents to those resources. Same at the other end of the spectrum, connecting parents with vocational rehabilitation, if that's something that could be beneficial to them, connecting parents to outside counseling services. And many of our districts have a list of what those services are. But part of your role as a special ed teacher is to not necessarily know it all, but be able to know how to connect people to individual resources or know who within your district can help connect them to those resources so that they're not only getting the supports that they need in school, but they're getting supports that they need outside of school as well. So now we're going to end with an activity today. So I'm going to have you review the picture, and either with your mic or chat box seems to be preferred with this group. Go ahead and type in what you notice about the picture that I'm showing you. I see lots of people getting close to their screens. I know it's kind of hard to see. It's overwhelming. Looks lonely. There's a knife on the coffee table. Some areas are highlighted with color. Dark, chaotic, unsafe, unhealthy. Screaming or crying child. Kids are on their own. Busy, many different children with needs. The parent seems to be exhausted. Is it safe? Maybe the parent's checked out a little bit. Kids are unsupervised. It's stressful. Okay. A lot going on. Now I want you to flip your perspective. And I just generally stated what's taking place within the picture. And many of your comments were more at the chaos in the room or the negative aspects of what's taking place. Now I want you to do your best and try and look at some of the positive things within the picture. Let's flip our perspective a little bit. The baby's in a crib and safe. There's food on the table. Pizza, great idea for dinner. May happen at my house tonight. Everyone has their own space. There's furniture. The electricity's on. There's a heater. The mom is taking some time for herself. Absolutely. There's pictures on the wall. Someone had to care enough to decorate. I don't know if you can tell in the middle. I don't see trash lying about. Yeah, it's in the trash can in the back. If you can see, like in that doorway, the trash can's overflowing, but at least it's in the trash can, right? We have a mom sitting here who has curlers in her hair. So potentially she cares about that outside appearance. There's an ironing board out. Now, the iron, probably the placement of it isn't fantastic next to the crib, right? But it's out. So she's obviously doing some laundry. It feels like a home. It's cluttered, but it looks clean. I think this activity is pretty eye-opening, that when we look at situations, we have implicit bias that we're bringing. And immediately when I look at this picture, I see the knife on the table. And several of you commented on that before. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, that is not safe. We have a baby sleeping over here in the corner. We have one right next to the knife. And you just want to remove that. But we forget to look at all of the things that are going well, and that this mother is trying to do her best to support her children and take care of them. And maybe that, like someone said, she's taking some me time with that crying baby in the crib. She just needs a minute to get it together. And so when we look at collaborating with our parents and our families, we have to consider that home lives all look different. And we may have grown up different than this, or maybe our house looks exactly like this. But what we have to recognize are the strengths within this family. And not that we're going to not talk about the things that we can improve, but there are many things going right in this picture. And rather immediately looking at what's not going well, start to change our perspective a little bit and recognize that people are different and what people value are different. Another thing that I think is so important for us to know, we are all educators. And so for us, going into a school environment is where we feel comfortable. We decided after 12 years or 13 years of K-12 education, and then after college, that we wanted to go back into that school building. Something about that tells me you probably enjoyed your time within school. But we have students and we have parents and families who don't have that same perspective on education. And we need to work with parents and families where they're at and create an environment where it's welcoming to come in and it doesn't create that anxiety that they had in the past, maybe as a child coming into our building. So think about how parents are coming to us, whether that's in the form of their socioeconomic status, in the form of their house, whether it's their culture, their diversity, and how do we start to understand that, because knowing that it could be different than our own and our own experiences are different, and how do we start to recognize and celebrate the differences in people rather than just noting the things that are different and make us maybe feel uncomfortable. So when we're talking about the resources for parents and families, it talks about positive interactions that we can have with them. So there's information about communication that we're providing. How do we help parents and families understand what we're doing in the classroom? So what does it mean when I send home a score of a Lexile of 374? Like, that means nothing to some of our parents. We don't know what that number means. So how do we help them understand that language? Educators are great at the alphabet soup, especially special educators and the acronyms. How do we help parents and families understand what those mean? And how do we prep them for those case conferences or meetings so that they feel comfortable coming in? What's your role going to be? How do we support them prior to coming in? And then there's other opportunities for interaction. So how are we meeting the best mode of communication for those parents? Is it a meeting because they don't have access to email? Is it a phone call, but it has to be a phone call after 8 p.m. because that's when they get off work? How are we helping those parents be an active participant within their child's education and really making them feel as if they're a member of the team? So let's talk a little bit about what's next. What else can be done? You've talked about many of the things that are already taking place. And I would say with collaboration, you hit the nail on the head with many of the topics that are brought up in the high leverage practice trifolds. After today's conversation, or even just thinking about current practices, what can you do differently to support other professionals or collaborate with other professionals? Or maybe you feel pretty positive about this aspect. Share and be welcoming. More efficient with other people's time. Share resources. Absolutely. Listen first and share solutions. Be mindful of their time. Absolutely. All right, let's move to the next one. How about effective meetings? Oh, sorry, communicate often. Set times that work for people. Ask open-ended questions. Reach out with more positive to parents. Be accepting of advice and solutions given to you. All right, so what can we do differently to engage in effective meetings? Give space for all voices to be heard. Go into the meeting knowing what you're going to talk about. Focus on minutes. Set time limits for things. Have a schedule. Take notes. Definitely mindful of time. Everybody seems to have that. Stick to the agenda. Have a schedule. Summarize at the end. And maybe even the summary at the end comes with a written communication at the end. Remember to follow up on this task, or here's who said they would do what to ensure that it happens. Being more proactive than reactive. Make sure all stakeholders know we were on a team for the student. Wonderful. And lastly, what are we going to do differently around supporting parents and families within this collaborative process of education? Consistent open lines of communication. Remain open-minded. Attempt to celebrate positives. Be real with parents. I like it. Give them resources to support at home. Listen, ask for what they need. Communicate regularly. That's key. Intentional listening. Reach out before and after meetings. Constant communication. And you have some parents who you could email every day and they will want more communication. You have other families who, when you email once a week, that might be as much as they can handle. So you start to learn as you develop that relationship and rapport with your parents. All right, so let's close out by talking about look-fors. So when we talk about the first three high leverage practices around collaboration with other professionals and team meetings, and then reaching out to parents and families, there are specific look-fors that we want to see on a consistent basis. So think about, as we go through these, what are you already doing well and what could you improve upon? So relationship and rapport with colleagues, investing time and efforts and energy into that so that you can start really working well together and having that sense of collective teacher efficacy in order to support student learning. Resource share, that was said multiple times throughout the chat. Problem solve using data alongside colleagues. So are you understanding the data? Are they understanding the data? How are you using that to inform practices? Shared responsibility down to the vocabulary instead of yours versus mine, using ours. and then making sure that everyone is held accountable. So it's not just the special education teacher's responsibility. It's not just the general education teacher's responsibility. How do we work together to improve those outcomes? Look for effective meetings. So we want meeting norms and goals set, really looking at promoting participation of all members of the team. Start off with welcomes and introductions so that everyone is aware of who's in the meeting and what their purpose and role is within the meeting. Ensure equal voice and provide prompts and questions to engage participants. Promote understanding through common language, so making sure that you're speaking in terms that everyone can understand. And summarize the meeting and establish next steps of what's going to happen. And then look for both parents and families. We want open and honest communication, keeping it real, as somebody said in the chat log. Multiple modes. If you can't get a hold of them one way, how can we try another way? And as you know, in special education, if we don't document it, it doesn't happen. So documenting our communication with parents. Giving parents some knowledge of what we're doing within the classroom. What are these evidence-based practices that you're utilizing, and why are you utilizing them? And how do we help parents understand that? Definitely communicating high expectations for our students, how we have them at school and how they should have them also within the home environment. Just treating others with dignity and respect. So having that awareness. And understanding that there's cultural diversity amongst all of our learners that we are working with. And then share ideas and action to support student learning. So those are the 3 first high leverage practices all around collaboration. Our next session will be November 10th. And we're going to talk about the importance of assessment and understanding the data. So that'll take place on November 10th. And then on January 12th, we'll do social emotional behavioral techniques and strategies. And on March 9th, we will close out with what is special about special education and really focusing on those instructional practices, including SDI accommodations and modifications. Thank you all so much for joining today. If you need to reach out to me, my email address is on the screen. So marcy.wilburn@indstate.edu. And before you leave, I know it's 4:30, but Todd did put the exit ticket to offer feedback and verify attendance within the chat. So please click on that link and complete that as well. And he's putting up the QR code as well.
Thank you so much, Marcy. Thanks everybody for being here this afternoon too. I think we just had great feedback from the morning session. Hopefully you all felt the same, and we're just really excited to kick this off with Marcy this year. I think this is going to be great professional development for our entire district. So appreciate your time. Have a great evening. Todd, anything to add? Do your exit ticket besides that?
Yep, complete your exit ticket. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay, thanks guys. Good to see all of you.
Thanks. Have a good one.